Lighted Diep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. But sometimes peace is only a dream. Bad news from Cambodia has shaken CEO James's world, forcing him to walk down a dangerous path. With every step he takes, uncertainty grows, and to Diep's heart trembles with fear. Will love be strong enough to guide him back safely? Or will this journey change their lives forever? The night sky over Phnom Penh was heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the city, suffocating the streets below. James stood by the hotel window, his hands resting on the glass, watching the traffic snake its way through the darkness. He had been abroad for weeks, managing the company's workers, ensuring machines ran smoothly, and calming his father's worries. Outwardly, everything appeared stable, but inside, James was falling apart. Every evening he whispered the same question to himself: does Diep still wait for me? Or will I return to find her gone? The thought consumed him. He longed for the quiet warmth of Vietnam, for Diep's voice soft like rain on rice fields, for the life he had promised her. But just as the company began to steady, a message arrived like a knife through his fragile calm. The news came from Cambodia, an urgent call from an old business partner. Funds had gone missing. Shipments were blocked, and whispers of corruption circled in the shadows. Worse, James learned that a dangerous figure, tied to smuggling and underground dealings, had tangled the company in a trap. If James ignored it, the entire foundation of his family's empire could collapse. If he faced it, he would step into a world where contracts and signatures meant nothing, where power was measured in threats and hidden deals. He sat in silence that night, the phone heavy in his hand. His father's words rang in his memory: sometimes, to protect what we built, we must walk through fire. But James's heart screamed another truth: if I walk this path, will I ever return to Vietnam? To her. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Diep's days were filled with ordinary struggles. Yet her heart carried extraordinary strength. She rose with the sun, worked in the fields, and cared for little Nee, the child who had been lost and now clung to her as if she were family. Neighbors teased her gently about James, but she always smiled and answered the same: I will wait, no matter how long. Yet every night, when the candles burned low, she stared at the phone that never rang and wondered if silence was the beginning of loss. When James finally called, his voice was strained, lower than she remembered. Diep, he whispered, things are not safe here. I have to stay longer. I can't tell you everything yet, but I need you to trust me. Diep closed her eyes, tears forming as she pressed the phone to her ear. James, I will trust you. Just promise me one thing: come back alive. Don't let ambition take you so far that you can't return. Her words shook him more than the threats from Cambodia. For the first time, James realized the true danger was not losing his company, it was losing the girl who had been waiting under the Vietnamese rain. The next morning, James stepped into a world of shadows, where every handshake could be betrayal and every smile could hide a weapon. He carried with him not just the burden of a CEO, but the weight of a man torn between empire and love. Would he survive the storm in Cambodia? Would he find a way back to Diep? Or would the dangerous path swallow him whole before he ever saw Vietnam again? The answer lay hidden in the nights ahead, but one truth remained clear: every risk James faced, every decision he made, was driven by a single hope that one day, no matter the cost, he would walk back into Diep's arms and say, I am home. The streets of Phnom Penh grew darker with every step James took into the underworld of business. Meetings were no longer in glass offices, but in dim cafes with curtains drawn, in warehouses that smelled of rust and gasoline. The man who had contacted him, known only as Daryl, warned him bluntly: your company's shipments are being held. Someone wants to break you. If you walk away now, you lose everything. If you fight, you risk your life. James's blood ran cold, but he masked it behind the calm of a CEO. Inside, though, he felt the weight of Diep's voice, her plea, "Don't let ambition take you so far that you can't return." At night, when the deals ended and the city's neon lights flickered like dying stars, James sat alone in his hotel room. He looked at his phone, tempted to call Diep, to hear her steady words again. But he couldn't tell her the truth, not about the threats, not about the smuggling networks, not about the shadowy figure behind it all. Protecting her meant keeping her in the dark. Still, he typed a message before sleep. "I'm thinking of you. Wait for me." Back in Vietnam, Diep's life went on, though the silence between them was heavy. She tended her garden, harvested melons, and taught little niece simple words and songs. Sometimes, when neighbors visited, they noticed the weariness in her eyes. One evening, the child asked softly, "See, Diep, does James love you if he never comes home?" Diep knelt down, kissed Nee's forehead, and whispered, "Yes, he loves me." Sometimes love is tested by distance, but no storm lasts forever. Yet, when she was alone, her heart trembled. She prayed silently each night, afraid that fate would steal James away before he could return. In Cambodia, the storm reached its peak. James discovered the truth: someone close to his own circle had betrayed him, feeding information to John, the rival who had long wanted his empire destroyed. The shipments were only bait. The real plan was to drag James into illegal dealings that would ruin both his business and his freedom. When Dara handed him a folder of evidence, James's hands shook. There were photos, bank records, names he recognized. He realized he had walked onto a battlefield far more dangerous than corporate competition. This was survival. The next night, as rain hammered the city, James made his choice. He would not give in. He would gather the evidence, expose the traitors, and then return to Vietnam, no matter the cost. But in the shadows of the street, he felt eyes following him. Danger was closing in, and time was running out. At that very hour, Diep sat by the window of her small home, the sound of rain drumming on the roof. She held a candle, whispering his name as if the flame could carry her voice across the sea. And somewhere in the darkness of Cambodia, James whispered back into the storm, "Diep, wait for me. I will find my way home." The rain in Phnom Penh refused to stop. James walked quickly through the back alleys, his jacket soaked, his pulse racing. He clutched the folder of evidence under his arm as if it were his only shield. Behind him, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone was following. He turned sharply into a narrow street. A black car screeched to a halt at the corner. Two men stepped out, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. James realized this was no coincidence. They had been sent. His instincts told him John's shadow had reached Cambodia. James ran. The city blurred past him, neon lights bleeding into the wet pavement. A gunshot cracked the night air. People screamed and scattered, but James didn't stop until he burst into the riverfront, chest heaving, eyes scanning for escape. His phone buzzed a single message from an unknown number. "Give up, James, or you'll never see Diep again." His body froze. They knew her name, his most guarded secret. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Diep was not safe either. She was at the market, ranging her vegetables when a familiar voice called her name. She turned, and her heart tightened. It was John. His smile was polite, but his eyes carried something darker. "Diep," he said smoothly, picking up one of her melons. "Still living simply. But tell me, how long will you wait for a man who abandoned you?" Diep's hands trembled as she packed her basket, avoiding his gaze. "James did not abandon me. He is fighting for something greater than both of us." John leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Fighting, or drowning? Do you even know what he's doing abroad? Cambodia is not a place for dreams, it's a place where men like him disappear. Perhaps you deserve someone who can protect you, someone who is here. Diep's breath caught. For a moment, she felt the sting of fear. But then her voice steadied. I don't need protection from you. James is enough for me. John's smile faded, and in its place came a chilling calm. We'll see, he whispered before walking away. That night, Diep lay awake, her heart unsettled. She remembered the candle she had lit for James and prayed harder. She didn't know of the men chasing him through Cambodian streets or the gunfire in the distance, but she felt that the storm was no longer far away. It was reaching her doorstep, and James, drenched and breathless in a foreign city, knew the same truth. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for the right to go home or to Diep. Life often tests us in ways we cannot predict. For James, the successful CEO who once stood proudly at the top of his company, challenges came not only in the form of business rivals, but also in the shadows of betrayal and danger abroad. For Diep, who waited faithfully in Vietnam, the test was not in wealth or power, but in patience, trust, and the courage to believe in love when uncertainty clouded her future. From their journey, we learn that love is not measured by distance or by the comfort of easy days. True love reveals itself when everything else seems to fall apart. James could have chosen to stay abroad, build a new empire, and forget the quiet girl who once stood by his side. Yet in his heart, every decision, every risk was tied to one purpose: to return to Diep. Diep, too, faced her own storms, surrounded by doubts and even by the presence of John, who tried to shake her faith. She chose not to let fear or temptation weaken her heart. Her strength lay in waiting not passively, but with the courage to defend her love even when others mocked her for believing. The lesson here is powerful. Success, wealth, and ambition can be lost in a single storm, but loyalty and love can endure if we choose to protect them. James's path in Cambodia reminds us that life will push us into darkness, but it is the memory of those we love that becomes our light. Diep's steadfastness shows us that waiting is not weakness. It is the greatest act of love when it is filled with faith. In the end, life is not about how much we conquer, but about who we choose to hold on to when everything else slips away. Sometimes, giving up everything to return to the one we love is not a loss at all, it is the greatest victory.